But it's not all bad news. So now we get to go to look at some important ways to save our planet with food. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. You can play a role in fighting climate change just by eating. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to try to convince you. So because a huge portion of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the foods that we eat and our farming practices, we can actually address a significant portion of climate change by changing the things that we eat and our farming practices. So let's talk about a few ways to do this. So here are three strategies for individuals two strategies for individuals and one strategy for individuals and two strategies for industry and municipalities. So these are strategies that can help reduce the carbon footprint related to our food. So the first thing is eat less meat. As you can see, as the portion of meat in our diet decreases, that reduces the amount of CO2 or methane that's released into the environment. Meat is a very intensive food product, and it has a lot of climate greenhouse gases embedded in its production. Now, I typically do not like to talk about or encourage people to eat less meat because I think that can be counterproductive because meat is an important culturally relevant food for many Americans. And the way that I tackle this problem is different. What I would say to people is that I would not say eat less meat. I would say something like eat more vegetables. And the studies have shown that when people are encouraged to increase the vegetable content of their diet, they actually do decrease the amount of meat they eat simply because they're meeting their calorie needs with vegetables. So that seems to be a general tip for any kind of change. Don't tell people what not to do, tell people what they can do. So don't stress eating less meat or eating no meat, stress increasing the amount of vegetables that they eat. And that's good for your health, as everyone knows who's been to a doctor in their 40s. That's what the doctors tell you every single time you go. Number two, tackle food waste. So this is a municipal or industry-wide problem. Food waste increases our greenhouse gases. So one of the ways that you can address that is reducing your food waste. This could also be an individual action that you could take as well by decreasing the amount of food waste that you personally generate. And then there are systems of transportation that are far more efficient. I'm not sure what ground flying food means, but basically you shouldn't be flying food around. The cheapest and most efficient way, at least in terms of greenhouse gases, to transport food is by barge. But then trains are the next, and then finally vehicles. But flying planes is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, and so we shouldn't be using that method to transport our food whenever possible. In the United States, most of our food comes to us by boat, train, or truck. And then my favorite way to fight climate change, because this is the diet that I prefer anyway, is to eat the Mediterranean diet. Research has shown that if all of us or a high enough percentage of us shifted to adopt the Mediterranean diet, the greenhouse gas reduction that would happen would be equivalent to taking about 1 billion cars worth of pollution out of the planet every year. I love the Mediterranean diet because it's just really easy to cook. The meals are delicious, and also I don't usually eat a lot of red meat, dairy, or sweets anyway, so it just sort of makes it less of a priority in my cooking. If I'm sticking to the Mediterranean diet, I don't have to go out of my way to buy meat, red meat, or anything like that. And so interestingly enough, switching to the Mediterranean diet is also what I've learned is best for your health. There are probably people who would dispute that because everybody's got their favorite health conscious diet. But I think a lot of research indicates that this is a very healthy way to eat. So switching to the Mediterranean diet, good for your health and good for the planet as well. My favorite way to combat greenhouse gas emissions and climate change with our food is something that's called carbon farming. So remember that I mentioned that land use changes, converting natural ecosystems to farmland, can release greenhouse gas emissions in a variety of ways. We can actually reverse that by changing the practices of our agricultural systems. So in the past 20 years or so, carbon farming has become an important way to reduce carbon-related emissions. Carbon farming means doing your best to make your farm replicate the natural environment. So it means a much more diverse farm. It means to avoid tilling so that the soil doesn't get disturbed, so that carbon that gets sequestered in the soil stays there. It means growing crops in rotation with livestock so that the manure that's produced by cows and chickens, et cetera, is what's used to fertilize the crops. And that means that the carbon gets sequestered in the soil. It also is when cows are feeding on grasses rather than grains, they produce less methane as well. So there's all of these benefits to carbon farming. There's a great video called Soil Carbon Cowboys. I'll put that in the text. And it's just a fantastic look at these ranchers who have switched to carbon farming instead of like the CAFO, the confined animal farming that is more common in the industry. So Soil Carbon Cowboys is a great film about that. Actually, it's not even a film, it's just a 10-minute video on YouTube. Another of my favorites is called agrivoltaics. And when I first heard about this idea, I thought this is nuts. There's no way that this can actually work. There's just no way. Everything that I knew or thought I knew about agriculture and gardening for crops is just, this couldn't possibly happen. But apparently pairing solar panels with agriculture is a really beneficial way to reduce carbon emissions, and it actually increases yields, especially when you're in climates that parts of the world that have been subject to extreme heat and other climate related problems. So how does it work? Well, in Arizona, where solar panels are very effective because of our abundant days of sun, and our relatively few days, small number of days of cloudy weather, the challenge that for solar panels is that they get hot, and when they're exposed to the sun for 12 hours a day every day, they start to heat up around midday, and as they get hotter, their effectiveness at producing electricity, their efficiency decreases dramatically. So we see them very effective in the early morning. And then as we approach noon and in the afternoon, when they heat up, they drop off, their productivity drops off. When I had solar panels on my house, there was an app that I used to monitor the output, and you could see this every single day. They would be effective, really effective at about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and the hotter it got, the less electricity they produced. So why is that? Well, it's because as they heat up, they become less efficient at transferring electrons within the system, and as a result, they stop producing electricity effectively. And if you're in the desert in Arizona, you also know that full sun exposure to crops can be very damaging. So there's a lot of crops like lettuces, peppers, tomatoes, which in other parts of the world you would just grow in full sun. In Arizona, you would provide structures made from shade cloth to prevent them from being exposed to the sun. So what happens here, the reason that it might be important to pair solar panels with agriculture has to do with what happens when plants are growing. Plants are drawing water from the soil, and they're using it to create sugars and to grow, but they are also releasing a bunch of it throughout the day into the atmosphere. And in places like Arizona, where there's very low humidity to begin with, that has a cooling effect. It actually feels cooler. If you walk down the street in your neighborhood in the evening, it might still be 90 degrees, but if you walk by a park where there's lots of grass or trees, you feel a 10% or a 10-degree drop in the temperature just by walking, to that park where there's all this grass. And in fact, in Arizona, early in the 80s and 90s, there was this move to like replace all the lawns and all of the plants with like gravel or hardscape. And what people found is that their electricity bills shot up because that hardscape was just absorbing and releasing heat into their homes. And so now there's a movement to maybe you can have a small lawn, maybe that's a good idea, but to increase the number of native desert plants and keep them watered, not heavily watered, but appropriately watered for the climate. And they produce shade, they provide transpiration, they provide humidity, which cools your house down. So that's a real benefit to people who are living in the desert. And the same thing happens to these solar panels. When you grow crops under them, they cool the air above them around the solar panels, and the solar panels are far more efficient. And in some cases, that efficiency is just groundbreaking. It's gonna, if we can build this out on a large enough scale, it will give us the capacity to provide, a bigger chunk of our energy use in Arizona if we compare it with agriculture. And then the solar panels shade the crops they're growing under them, which allows them to grow better during the heat of the day. One of the schools that we work with in Tucson has a huge solar panel garden. So these are agri-PV gardens, lots of solar panels above their school garden space. And what they found there, what the students have found, because the students are the ones researching this, is that even though it's cooler during the summer months, so they're able to grow food better during the summer months, in the winter, it's actually warmer. It creates a little microclimate where the temperatures don't fluctuate enough as much. And so they're weirdly growing all of these little tropical fruit plants. So they've got, avocados, which don't grow well here. They've got papaya, guava, I think, and a few other tropical fruit plants that are you don't grow in Arizona because it's not humid enough, it's too hot, and we do have freezes in 1 or 2 times in the winter that would kill them. And so growing them in these little agri-PV gardens allows them to have a more tropical environment.